General Hospital spoilers reveal that Alexis felt the impact of Willow's verdict, like a violent force ripping through the courtroom, unraveling the fragile balance she had fought so hard to maintain. Even as the judge's words faded into the air, their echo remained lodged in her chest, a cold, heavy reminder that nothing in Port Charles would ever return to the way it was. Willow's acquittal was not simply a legal outcome. It was a shift in the narrative that rippled through every relationship, every alliance, every future Alexis thought she could still control. And as the courthouse emptied, Alexis realized with chilling clarity that she was the one now standing at the center of the fallout. Her crisis didn't begin with fear of losing. It began with the understanding of what winning meant. Willow walking free meant the world needed a new villain, and Alexis could already feel the pressure building to redirect blame, reshape stories, and reassign motives. None of that should have touched her, but it did, because Scout's future depended on the stability of the adults around her, and the ground beneath Alexis was shifting fast. She could feel the custody battle rising again like a storm that had only been sleeping. And with every new truth that surfaced, the storm grew stronger. Alexis's mind became a battlefield the moment the verdict was read. She knew Scout needed safety, clarity, emotional grounding, things Alexis could no longer guarantee. With Drew's situation crumbling, with Willow's past now peeled open for the world to examine, Alexis saw herself standing on an island rapidly shrinking beneath her feet. The truth was this: Scout's father was unraveling. Willow was tied to a crime that had nearly ended Drew's life, and Alexis could no longer pretend that any of them were the stable forces Scout needed. This was the heart of her crisis, the realization that she might need to take control, not because she wanted power, but because no one else could protect Scout from the consequences of her parents' collapsing lives. It wasn't just Willow's acquittal that haunted Alexis. It was the revelation of what was behind it, the shifting suspicions, the accusations being redirected, the fragments of truth pointing toward an explosive hidden reality. Alexis had sat through enough trials to recognize when a verdict did not end a story, but opened a darker chapter. And Willow's freedom came with a cost that Alexis feared Scout would eventually be forced to pay. The idea that Scout might one day look back and see her father's name tangled in accusation, whether true or not, shook Alexis to her core. Every instinct inside her screamed to take action, to shield Scout from the emotional shrapnel flying in every direction. She had spent years rebuilding her life, clawing her way out of addiction, trauma, and professional ruin. She was not going to let another courtroom disaster rip her family apart. Scout was the one pure thing in her life, the one person who deserved protection at any cost. And now, that cost was rising. Alexis pressed her trembling hands against the steering wheel as she sat alone in her car. After the verdict, her thoughts churned with the cold precision of a lawyer and the helpless terror of a mother. Drew was slipping emotionally, legally, psychologically. Willow was shattered, free but fractured, and anything unstable in Willow's world would eventually touch Scout. This was not paranoia. This was foresight. Willow's trauma, Drew's unraveling, and the shifting legal alliances created a volatile environment Alexis knew too well. She had lived that chaos. She had survived it. She would not let Scout be shaped by it. So Alexis began planning her next move, not as a lawyer, not as a political figure, but as a mother. The adjustment she made internally was subtle, but powerful, a shift from reacting to leading. She no longer cared about public opinion, apologies, or the emotional fragility of the adults involved. She would carve a new path for Scout with or without their cooperation. For the first time, Alexis was prepared to redefine the narrative of the entire case if that was what it took. To keep her daughter safe, her fear turned into resolve, her panic hardened into strategy. Yet every step she took toward reclaiming control brought her closer to a truth she didn't want to face. There was something Drew and Willow weren't telling her. Something dark, something dangerous, and Alexis could feel it pressing against the edges of her awareness, like a shadow waiting to reveal itself. She replayed every interaction, every hesitation, every contradiction. Drew's emotional instability, Willow's guilt buried beneath a calm exterior, the strange alignment of events that did not quite add up. It wasn't just about the shooting. It was the timeline, the secrecy, the inexplicable decisions. Alexis knew patterns. She knew lies. She knew trauma. And she knew when the people were hiding something large enough to destroy everything around them. The more she examined the threads, the more she saw that Drew and Willow's stories didn't merely overlap, they interlocked. Willow's acquittal had been the necessary first step in unburying the truth, but that truth had not yet been dragged into the light, and Alexis, whether she wanted it or not, was being pulled toward it. Her crisis evolved into obsession not with the case itself, but with understanding what exactly Scout was being exposed to. Her daughter deserved clarity, stability, honesty. Alexis could not give her that while pieces of the puzzle were missing, and every missing piece deepened her panic. She imagined futures where Scout would be forced to navigate the shame of having a father accused of crimes he couldn't prove he didn't commit. Futures where Willow's pain infected her daughter's world. Futures where the truth came too late for Scout to recover from its impact. Alexis refused to allow any of those futures to materialize, so she confronted the darkness head-on. She began following Drew's behavior more closely, observing the shifts in his tone, the inconsistencies in his explanations. She watched Willow, too, seeing the flickers of guilt and fear that surfaced when she believed no one was looking. The patterns formed quickly, too quickly, and Alexis felt her stomach twist with realization. They were not just hiding the past. They were preparing for something, and that something involved Scout. The panic that rose inside her was sharper than anything she had felt before. She could not afford hesitation. Not now. Not when the entire foundation of her daughter's life was trembling under the weight of unspoken truths. Alexis knew what she had to do. She had to fight, not for justice, not for reputation, for Scout. The adjustment within her solidified into a mission, one that would place her directly in opposition to Drew, indirectly against Willow, and inevitably against anyone who believed she was overreacting. But Alexis had been burned by doubt before. She had learned to trust her instincts, and now those instincts screamed at her to take control of the narrative. Before it consumed them all, her crisis transformed into action as she prepared for the next steps: legal, emotional, strategic. She was ready to challenge custody, ready to expose inconsistencies, ready to force Drew and Willow to confront whatever truth they were hiding. She would tear down the walls of secrecy brick by brick if that was what it took, because Scout's future depended on it. And Alexis, trembling but resolute, accepted that she was stepping into a war she could not lose, not as a lawyer, not as an advocate, but as a mother awakened by fear, sharpened by truth, and driven by a love that would not allow her to stand still while the world around her crumbled. This was no longer about Willow's acquittal. It was about what came after. And Alexis knew, with terrifying clarity, that the real battle was only beginning. Alexis could feel her world contracting in on itself, tightening like a fist around her ribs as the reality of Willow's acquittal settled over Port Charles like a suffocating fog. What should have been a moment of clarity, a clean turning point in a tangled legal nightmare, instead became the catalyst for a deeper unraveling that seeped into every corner of her life. She had expected anger, confusion, argument, anything but the cold, brutal emptiness that hit her when the judge declared Willow innocent. In that instant, Alexis understood with shattering clarity that all the pressure she had braced for was now shifting directly onto her, crushing her with a force she could neither predict nor outrun. Willow walking free meant the narrative had to change shape, and that shift would not favor her or Scout or the fragile stability she had fought so desperately to build. It meant Drew could step forward again with unearned authority. It meant Willow's hands appeared clean to the world, and it meant Alexis's concerns, her warnings, her instincts, her pleas were suddenly dismissed as emotional noise rather than the truth she knew they were. And as the courthouse emptied and the murmurs faded, Alexis felt reality slipping through her fingers. She did not have the luxury of collapsing. She had a daughter who depended on her, a daughter whose safety was entwined with two adults spiraling far deeper into darkness than anyone else realized. But even this knowledge could not steady her. If anything, it intensified the panic clawing at her chest, because now, with the world believing Willow innocent, Alexis could already see the consequences being rewritten. Drew would regain sympathy, Willow would regain credibility, and Alexis, who had dared to point out inconsistencies and push for accountability, was already being framed as unreasonable, reactive, intrusive. She felt it in the glances from the gallery, in the tightening expressions of the legal teams, in the way no one bothered to ask her what she thought or felt after the verdict. She was becoming invisible in the narrative, even as the dangers mounted. That was when she realized she needed backup, not from the court, not from public sentiment, but from people who understood power, pressure, and the brutality of truth. And that meant swallowing her pride and turning to Diane and Sunny, to people whose presence in her life had always been complicated, sometimes reassuring, sometimes infuriating, always charged with the weight of shared history. Asking for help felt like peeling away her own armor. Alexis had spent years rebuilding herself from broken pieces: her career, her dignity, her sense of self, and now she had to stand in front of Diane with her voice trembling, asking for strategic clarity because she could no longer trust her own judgment. Diane listened with that piercing lawyer's stare, absorbing every detail, every nuance, the unspoken desperation in Alexis's words. And Sunny, who had once been a point of contention rather than a source of support, stood silently, analyzing her panic with a calculation that was both unsettling and grounding. He understood fear, he understood obsession, and he understood the sudden shift of power that came with a verdict like Willow's. But even as they agreed to help her, even as Diane offered legal pathways and Sunny offered leverage, Alexis felt no relief, only escalation. Because the verdict did not merely free Willow from legal responsibility, it empowered her. It placed her back into Scout's orbit with renewed legitimacy. And Drew, who had spent months spiraling into emotional instability, masked as heroic suffering, now had the sympathy of the town and a sudden absence of blame to hide behind. Alexis saw how dangerous that combination could become. To people bound by the trauma of a shared secret, now held the emotional and legal advantage over her daughter's future. And Alexis could already see the consequences stacking themselves like dominoes. If Drew regained stability in the public eye, he would push for more control over Scout. If Willow appeared emotionally healed, she would be allowed deeper influence over Scout's life as well. And Alexis, with her history, her vulnerabilities, and her visible panic, would be painted as the unstable one, the unreasonable one, the mother who needed to be managed rather than trusted. The pressure of this realization was enough to make Alexis feel unsteady on her feet. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became that Willow's acquittal was not the end of a legal battle, but the beginning of a psychological war. The story was shifting rapidly, and Alexis was losing ground with every passing hour. Public sentiment had turned against her. The system was no longer on her side. And Scout, her brilliant, vulnerable daughter, was now caught in the crossfire of two adults hiding the very truth that had nearly destroyed them. Alexis had seen this pattern before. She knew what happened when trauma was buried instead of confronted, when lies were allowed to fester, when guilt wrapped itself around people until they disguised it as strength. She had lived it. She had watched families collapse under its weight, and now she feared she was about to watch her own daughter become collateral damage in someone else's unresolved nightmare. It became clear that she could not wait for the truth to surface naturally. She would have to excavate it herself, digging through the layers of deceit, contradiction, and manipulation that Drew and Willow had woven. Alexis was terrified of what she might find, but more terrified of what would happen if she didn't look. And as she stood in her living room that night, staring at Scout asleep on the couch with her hand curled near her face, Alexis felt something inside her harden. A shift, a resolve, a willingness to fight with every part of herself, even the parts she had worked so hard to repair. She would go after Drew. She would expose the cracks in his story, force him to confront the truth he had buried, strip away the illusions he had been sheltering behind. She would do the same to Willow if she had to, because the world might be willing to forgive them, or ignore the inconsistencies, or accept the verdict as a neat ending. But Alexis knew better. She knew trauma leaves fingerprints long after the court stops looking. She knew secrets poison everything they touch. And she knew a lie defended with desperation was always more dangerous than a truth confessed in shame. The pressure she felt, the oppression of being dismissed, ignored, belittled, did not crush her. It transformed into fuel. Madness, perhaps. Determination, absolutely. Alexis began plotting her next moves with an intensity that bordered on obsession, gathering evidence, reconstructing timelines, watching Drew's behavior shift now that the weight of suspicion had lifted from him, observing Willow's attempts to appear composed while the shadow of her actions still clung to the edges of her expression. Alexis was not seeking vengeance. She was seeking protection. For Scout, for the fragile stability of a family she had spent years piecing together. And if the world insisted on calling her irrational for refusing to accept an incomplete truth, then she would embrace the label and turn it into strength. Because Alexis Davis had been underestimated before, overlooked, discounted. But a mother fighting for her child is never weak, never broken, never done. She becomes something relentless, something unstoppable, something the world cannot ignore. Willow's acquittal had changed the story, yes, but Alexis was ready to rewrite the next chapter herself. And this time, she would not be gentle. Alexis felt the world tilt beneath her as the new evidence broke through the last remaining defenses Willow had built around herself. It didn't arrive quietly or gradually. It crashed into Port Charles, like a verdict delivered by fate itself, undeniable and irreversible. Photos, ballistic reports, witness confirmations, digital timestamps, every piece snapped into place with a terrible clarity, pointing to one truth Alexis had sensed long before the rest of the town dared to consider it. Willow had shot Drew, not metaphorically, not emotionally, not symbolically. She had stood in the middle of her fractured world and pulled the trigger, and now the truth had finally found its way to the surface. And as Willow was led away in handcuffs, pale and shaking, her future collapsing like a fragile structure built on lies, Alexis felt the weight of months' years lift from her chest. It was not relief. It was not triumph. It was a single, devastating realization. Now the real fight begins. For too long, Alexis had been treated as though her instincts were warnings formed from paranoia, as if her concern for Scout was an overreaction rather than the clear-eyed truth. She had spent her life learning to identify. She had been dismissed by judges, misinterpreted by friends, treated like a woman fighting shadows that weren't there. But now, with Willow's arrest splashed across the courthouse steps, it became impossible to deny what Alexis had known all along. Drew and Willow were a storm waiting to break, and Scout had been living at the edge of that storm without protection. The truth did not vindicate Alexis. It awakened her. She knew immediately that she could not wait, not for the system to reevaluate, not for Drew to steady himself, not for Willow to unravel further. Scout needed stability, safety, grounding, and Alexis realized with terrifying clarity that she was the only one capable of giving her that now. Not Drew, whose guilt and emotional volatility had been boiling beneath his skin long before Willow ever pulled the trigger. Not Willow, whose fractured psyche had finally shattered in a violent act she'd fought desperately to hide. Alexis alone could stand between her daughter and the chaos now spreading through both households, like a toxin. So she prepared herself not for a conversation, not for a plea, but for war. The legal system, once the enemy she feared, was now the weapon she intended to wield. She had played by the rules before, and it had nearly cost Scout everything. This time, she would not be gentle. She would not compromise. She would not assume the judges understood the danger or that the courts would move fast enough to protect her child. Alexis had spent decades understanding how justice worked and equally how it failed. She knew how quickly public sympathy could distort truth, how grief could become a defense, how a narrative could be rewritten until the world believed the victim was the aggressor, and the aggressor the victim. She had seen it, lived it. Fought it, and she refused to let her daughter become another casualty of a system that often didn't see danger until it was too late. Willow's arrest provided the leverage Alexis needed, but leverage alone was not enough. This fight required precision, calculation, unwavering resolve. So she began quietly gathering every piece of evidence, every inconsistency in Drew's behavior, every emotional crack that had widened in the wake of the shooting. She documented the nights he showed up at the Quartermain estate disoriented and angry. She recalled the way he had insisted Willow was innocent long after it made sense to defend her. She remembered every contradiction in his timeline, every shift in his tone, every moment that suggested he was hiding something deeper than grief. But more importantly, she remembered Scout, her laughter, her fear, her confusion, her innocence, and Alexis felt something ancient and unbreakable rise inside her. A mother's instinct sharpened into a blade. As Port Charles erupted with speculation, every citizen choosing a side in the drama that refused to die, Alexis watched silently from the sidelines, calculating her next moves. She could see which way public opinion was turning. She could sense the panic in Drew's posture, the trembling in Willow's voice as she was forced to admit the truth, the desperation in Michael's eyes as he realized the courts might use this revelation against him. In custody battles he thought he had already secured. Everyone was scrambling, everyone was afraid. But Alexis, despite her trembling hands and her racing heart, had never seen the road ahead so clearly. This was her moment to reclaim her daughter's safety. She approached Diane first, not as a friend, not as a colleague, but as the only lawyer ruthless enough to carry this battle to its brutal conclusion. Diane didn't need the entire explanation. She saw the truth reflected in Alexis's expression and the gravity of the situation etched into the lines around her eyes. Alexis laid everything out: the danger, the deception, the emotional instability of both Willow and Drew. She did not embellish, she did not soften, she presented the case as it was, raw and unfiltered. And Diane, to her credit, didn't flinch. She nodded, slow and deliberate, the way a strategist does when all the pieces align in a way that cannot be ignored. Sonny was next, not because Alexis trusted him not fully, but because Sonny understood the darker layers of people that courts refused to acknowledge. He had lived among broken men, violent men, dangerous men. He had seen firsthand how suppressed trauma turned into catastrophic decisions. And Sonny had always had a soft spot for Alexis, a connection grounded in history, in parenthood, in regret and compassion intertwined. When Alexis approached him, Sonny didn't offer comfort. He offered clarity. He told her plainly that she was right to be afraid, that Drew was unraveling, that Willow's emotional deterioration had been visible long before the truth came out. And there, in the unspoken space between them, Sonny made her a promise, not of violence, not of interference, but of vigilance. Scout would not be hurt on his watch. Still, even with their support, Alexis felt her resolve tighten further, because this battle was no longer just about exposing Drew or holding Willow accountable. It was about shifting the entire structure of custody, rewriting the expectations placed upon her, demonstrating beyond all question that she was the only adult capable of offering Scout stability, grounded in reality rather than delusion. She prepared filings, documented evidence, reconstructed timelines, and built a narrative that no court could ignore. A narrative that showed a mother fighting not out of spite, not out of fear, but out of necessity. But as she worked through the night, crafting arguments with trembling fingers, Alexis felt another truth pulling at the edges of her thoughts, one far more painful than anything she had admitted aloud. She was obsessed with the need to protect Scout, obsessed with uncovering every lie Drew had told, obsessed with understanding the depth of Willow's emotional collapse, obsessed with making sure the world knew she had been right all along. And while the obsession terrified her, a reminder of darker times, darker impulses, she also knew it was the only thing keeping her from collapsing under the weight of everything at stake. The more she thought about Willow in that interrogation room, crying and shaking, offering broken apologies that couldn't undo the damage she had caused, the more she pictured Drew standing outside the station, jaw clenched, eyes wild, as he tried to make sense of the fact that the woman he defended had nearly killed him. The more Alexis saw chaos expanding outward like a virus, infecting everything it touched, and Scout was standing too close. Alexis could not let her stay there. She would go to war for her daughter, against Drew, against the system, against public perception, against the shadows of her own past, against anything that threatened the fragile life she had worked so hard to rebuild. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't ego. It was survival. It was motherhood. And as the sun began to rise over Port Charles, casting long, thin rays of gold across her legal documents, Alexis felt the final shift click into place. Willow had fallen, Drew was unraveling, and Alexis Davis was just getting started.